Hi, my name is Grant Howard. Welcome to this second chapter in the first section where we're going to talk about clinician engagement, or more particularly how we get clinicians and management involved in the same structure with the same purpose. In the first chapter, in this introductory section, we talked about patient-centered services and some of the features of purposeful design to meet that end. And so now we want to cover off two things: features of organizations that involve clinicians, and then in a more general sense, features of organizations that are designed for accountability and high performance. Let's start with the conditions that having clinicians imposes on organizations and how you then build a patient-centered organization. Clinicians in health organizations work in two ways. Let's call them roles. In the first role, they are members of a department, and they take part in the department's activities, hopefully orientated towards the patient. And so these are particular tasks like visiting a patient or having the patient visit them or operating on them or some other consideration that is consistent with whatever that department does. When it comes to designing an organization, the activities of the department have to be planned and managed. In the clinician's second role, they work in a service. Now the word service has a particular meaning. It's the experience of the patient as they go through a care episode, which requires the interaction of a number of departments, and it is the clinician who acts as the go-between, deciding what the patient gets from each of those departments. All clinical organizations must take into account this second role, which is about service management. If these roles are both recognized and managed, i.e. a department and a service, then life is simple, or at least simpler. If they're not, then what typically happens is a manager of a department gets put under more and more pressure to control clinicians who are acting outside of the department in a service capacity. And so not only do we end up with unhappy managers, but no one really knows what's going on in each service, what is planned, what is actually happening, and how much resource is being expended. There is a third component to consider, and that's the idea of a professional identity. So all surgeons are trained by surgical college, clinicians or physicians are trained in a different way. Unfortunately, the historical development of organizations mean that these professional divisions are often the predominant and most recognizable organizational construct, but they're neither patient-centered nor service-orientated. And so the challenges in designing a clinical organization are to make sure that the patient is at the center of the service and therefore organizational design, and that both roles of clinicians are being recognized and managed in a constructive way. Now let's talk about design principles in any organization in a general sense and how they should be applied. Let's start off with what I would call good housekeeping. So in any organization, one person can have many roles. There's no problem with a person wearing more than one hat, but in each role they can only report to one person, or more specifically, one role. This is important. The person they report to must be also the person who manages and supervises them on a day-to-day basis. There's no point in separating out these responsibilities, not in an accountable organization anyway. It's also worth pointing out that any person can manage any group as long as they can add value to what the group does. So the idea that only a nurse can manage nurses or a doctor can manage doctors is simply irrelevant. Beyond these general principles of good housekeeping, there are specific rules that relate to accountability and the ability to be accountable. So, for anyone to be accountable, they must know who they're accountable to, and they must know who's accountable to them. They must know what they have to do, and they must have control over the system and processes required to deliver that part or product. The resources must be reasonably agreed upon in order for that outcome to be achieved, and all of these things must be brought together in an operational plan which describes how much of what will be produced against a particular quality requirement. So, to recap, in this chapter aimed at introducing some important concepts, we've talked about specific healthcare organization features, namely the roles of clinicians, and both services and departments have to be recognized, planned, and managed. And we've also touched on features of good housekeeping and accountable design that I would lump under the heading of requisite design. Now, if you recognize these things and you implement them properly, then clinical engagement becomes an irrelevant concept. You only need to engage clinicians if they sit outside the management structure, or worse, the management structure is bolted onto the clinical goings-on day to day. Now, the point of this chapter was never to describe in detail how you go about fixing your problems. That'll come later in section 2, using management tools like the organizational profile. What we're doing here is simply trying to make you as curious as possible so that you'll read on and get an increased understanding of what it is we'd like you to do. Until then, good luck.